Happy to have with us today Salah Chafik, who will talk to us about Maslaha in the Maghreb, the role of traditional institutions in shaping the Commonwealth. Salah holds a PhD from Tallinn University of Technology and has studied at the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and traditional Islamic seminaries in West Africa. At IIPP, maybe he'll tell us what that is.
Sure.
Salah is the co-investigator and project manager for the Islamic Public Value Project funded by the John Templeton Foundation. So please, welcome, Dr. Chafik.
Thank you so much. Let me just make sure I don't get interrupted by my phone. So yes, my name is Salah. Thank you all for having me. So IPP is the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and it's kind of a mix of public policy, administration, innovation scholars, just looking at, from I guess a variety of perspectives, from micro to meso to macro, on the role of the state and other institutions in steering technological innovation, governance, etc., towards, once again, kind of commonwealth. So this project fits within the Institute, and specifically I'll talk to you today about some of my latest research. So to start, I guess, what is public value? I think this was actually inspired by Professor Yilmaz. I think it's important to, at times, indigenize vocabulary. And so Maslaha in Arabic, or Maslaha al-Amma, is at least a 1,000-year-old tradition, both in practice and in I guess, scholarship, that talks about more or less what I'd say public value, right? For those not familiar, on the heels of Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan back in the 80s, there was a movement known as New Public Management, or NPM, and it was basically trying to take everything about the public sector and turn it into the private sector. So cutting costs, all about like efficiency. A famous example is if a bus stops and there's a bunch of people there or whatever, still waiting to board the bus, it leaves at that exact time because it's more important that it leaves on time and hits those indicators, right, versus picking up the people. So what happened was in the 90s, there was emerging scholarship on something called public value, which was an alternative to this new public management, which said that, well, actually, if we zoom out, the role of institutions, especially public ones, are to contribute towards the common good, right? And since then, I think that the dust has settled, and new public management has proven to be quite a failure. And there's been a lot of now reforms trying to bring back capacity to civil servants in the public sector, etc. However, there's kind of still an assumption with public value that there's a global Western mainstream. And so therefore, we might look towards Washington, perhaps Brussels, in terms of where to start, right? And also the goals, agenda setting, etc. Whereas I think it's really important to think about other contexts and other paradigms, let's say. So my research focuses on the Islamic paradigm. Now, if we, I guess, drill down a bit more, I've made the argument now that Maslaha is public value, but we still haven't defined really either. The starting point for me is living and doing good. And this, I guess, traces back to the early Greeks. Aristotle, in Greek, called it eudaimonia. We have Al-Farabi, known as the second teacher in the Islamic tradition, who called it, in Arabic, السعادة القصوى, or the greater happiness. So basically, the larger goal of the society is about both living and doing good. So in my research, I think about kind of studying and capturing living and doing good with, let's say, 3 conditions. First is I look at institutions and not individuals. Secondly, the type of institutions I look at are indigenous. And what I mean by that is traditional, so it's not like a recently created NGO or something like this, and also local, right? So it's very much embedded and rooted in that local tradition. And finally, as I was mentioning, leading up to this, Islamic. And of course, that could be also disputed and argued about, but for my purposes, if the institution sees itself as carrying out and basically embodying Islamic values, objectives, goals, then that's sufficient. So, by the way, there's no copyright infringements with pictures. These are all either pictures of me or by me. So, the different domains that I wanted to give you, I guess, a flavor of public value can be really kind of wide-ranging. There could be water systems. I have a colleague actually looking at the traditional Andalusian water management system that recently, due to droughts in Spain, they're trying to kind of excavate and see if they could use once again, which is really interesting. There's, of course, agriculture, be it including livestock and things like this, apart from the obvious thing with trees, vegetables, etc. Public works and infrastructure, education, and of course we have examples of a madrasa or, in Indonesia, pesantren, other examples. We have things like crafts. A lot of these indigenous institutions were once based around almost the equivalent of guilds. They're based around a certain craft and kind of pass that on, and there's the apprenticeship, etc. There's also things like basic social care, right, and dispute resolution. So in today's talk, I'd like to talk about two cases. One is an apiary, which for those that are not familiar, that's a place where honeybees are kept, and obviously honey is therefore produced. And in that example, you'll see kind of this notion of a commons, agriculture, etc., as well as craft. And then the second are institutions known as zawaya, which, yeah, they kind of display and cover a bunch of different domains, let's say, for creating public value. And so to jump in, I like to start out actually with a scholar who's regarded, at least in the Western tradition, as kind of the founding father of modern political theory. His name is Johannes Althusius, and he was a 16th century Calvinist syndicate, and basically, I guess, faqih in our tradition, right? So he first theorized that every human association concerning two or more people is political by nature, right? And he kind of gave a taxonomy of 5 different levels of that, 5 types. The first is the realm, which in our time we think of as the state, then the province, followed by the city, and then for our purposes, what's really interesting is the collegium. And then under the collegium is the family. So there's kind of this institution he's talking about between the city and family level. And he talked about this in kind of the context of devolution. For those that are not familiar, the UK, where I am now, is, I guess, is a textbook example of devolution. So, for example, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland have devolved, status, their own parliaments, their own things like this. So it's this notion of giving autonomy, the center giving autonomy to decentralization in a way. And I think that this kind of let's say theory is really helpful in thinking about natural resource management, right? This apiary that I hinted at, and I think it's really helpful to kind of categorize between doing so in an NGO kind of way, right, versus having kind of an indigenous collegium. And to understand the collegium a bit more, Althusius defined it as 3 or more men of the same trade, training, or profession, being united for the purpose of holding in common such things that they jointly profess as duty, way of life, or craft. And I think that's a really helpful definition. And I'm sure also he meant, obviously, women as well. So in today's parlance, the gender inclusivity. Now, members of a collegium, which are known as colleagues, and that's where the word comes from, are ruled and are obligated in their collegium by the same right and laws. So it's almost this this institution that kind of sets, let's say, like the social norms, right, and kind of the way of life of its members. Now, in that vein, I'm looking at this apiary known as Inzerki in southern Morocco, and I think it's helpful to regard it then as kind of this indigenous collegium that is actually 500 years old now and is considered the oldest and largest traditional apiary in the world. Now, Inzerki was founded, as I said, in 1520, so about 500 years ago, initially by this kind of amateur beekeeper. And the backstory here is quite important to help us understand how, up to the present day, the institution still kind of functions and bases itself on. So initially, this beekeeper went to a local zawiya, or a Sufi, let's say, path, and visited the leader, the sheikh, asking for his advice on beekeeping, as well as asking for, let's say, his blessings, right, his prayers, etc., and what's known as barakah. And the sheikh's sole advice was, make sure you find a place where the bees will be at ease. And so the reason behind that is essentially animals in general, of course, have a certain sacred status, let's say, in Islam in their own rights, but bees in particular have a special status, right? And there's, of course, the chapter in the Quran that mentions that bees, as long as they're kind of like free to forage and things like this, produce a liquid that has healing, right? Which is also known as honey. And so in order to have this healing honey, you have to make sure you treat the bees right. And so that was kind of the curious advice that the sheikh gave. Now, the beekeeper went back then to his village and laid kind of the first hive on a slope, which you saw earlier in the picture, that was right between mountains, had plenty of sunlight all day, plenty of flora for the bees to forage. And upon getting the first harvest, he went back to the zawiya to visit the sheikh and gifted honey, which the sheikh then gave to his students, and that became kind of an annual tradition of giving students honey every year, and that became like a festival and things like this. But in any case, the sheikh then kind of returned the favor and came back to the beekeeper's village, and he made prayers and all of this. And the villagers observed this, and they wanted to kind of like partake as the beekeeper started to kind of expand, because he had the blessing of the sheikh, and they wanted to also take part in kind of this sacred enterprise. So what you then had was, as you see in the picture here, initially that like one or two huts became what you see as the larger apiary. So that's kind of the background. And today, this apiary has basically heritage status, cultural heritage, etc., by recognition by the Moroccan state, as well as other international bodies, such as the Indigenous and Community Conserved Area, or ICA. And to this day, it doesn't charge any commissions or fees on using the apiary, nor on obviously the honey that's produced, but rather it's run and managed as a commons, a natural resource commons. So I think to give you a good idea about like how the rules are set, right, the shaping of social norms in this collegium, a really telling example is there's a ban on what are considered modern hives. You see those on the left-hand side, the kind of square rectangular hives. Now, this is really interesting because anecdotally, the beekeepers noticed that the bees are much more agitated and more difficult to work with, right, when they're in these boxes versus these cylindrical, kind of woven bamboo covered with adobe traditional hives. And in addition, they noticed that the traditional hives are much more resilient to the elements, especially drought in the context of Morocco, versus the ones in the boxes, which kind of colony failure is quite common. And finally, the boxes produce more than double the amount of honey annually than the traditional hives. But despite that, the beekeepers are adamant that the quality of the honey is much better in the traditional ones versus the modern. And what's telling is that this ban persists, despite the fact that, as I mentioned, the box ones produce basically 40 kilograms of honey annually versus about 10. So it's actually, quadruple. And it might be obviously true that if someone wants to move around the hives and help the bees forage or transportation to and from markets, the cylindrical ones are much more difficult to work with, right? So what this kind of shows is that the institutional goal is, and I should say was and is, not to maximize production or scale up, if you will, but it's actually the bee welfare still, right? And this is what I term, I guess, like a contentment or gratitude kind of enterprise, because you have to keep in mind this village is in a rural setting, a very rural setting, and in such a setting, beekeepers are, let's say they lay 20 hives per year, which is quite modest on the lower end. Given the current price in Morocco of honey per kilo, they're able to make in euros at least about 6,000 euros annually. if we compare this to civil servants in the big major cities like Rabat, Casablanca, Marrakesh, etc., the average public sector wage is 8.7 thousand euros. So it's basically a not just a scraping by, but a quite decent in this context, let's say, risk or livelihood that villagers can pursue by keeping this. So one important element I think to highlight is that beekeepers see their work and what they're doing as a craft and something that they should maintain and respect. So there's very much this notion of mentorship and kind of learning and apprenticeship. And to give you a flavor of that, so there's certain rituals with the harvesting of honey. For example, you can only do one hive at a time, so as not to disturb neighboring hives and the bees in them. There's daily limits about how many hives you can even do. There's a particular time of day. Specifically, it's between the third and fourth prayer, so between Asr and sunset prayer. And also, they as they're harvesting, they have kind of this mix on hand of olive leaves and manure. They kind of burn it, and that way it calms basically the bees. And what's really interesting is that even modern beekeeping uses smoke, for example. And so I think there's a lot to pursue there about, like, they've been doing this, but it's indigenous knowledge basically. But how much does that kind of map onto current, let's say, apiology or beekeeping, etc. So in any case, they also have like a meticulous level of care. So for example, they make another mix that's always on hand in case a little bit of honey drops. What happens is, if you leave it there, a bunch of bees start to swarm. So automatically, if there is the inevitable drop of honey, they kind of spray that mix to avoid that swarm. In addition, they, whenever they're kind of moving a queen or a colony or something like this, they're finished with the hive, they always burn incense and make sure that it's sterilized. And once again, we know through modern science as well that is a quite good sterilization technique. So this is a bit of, it gives you a bit of an idea about the craft itself. I also broke down kind of the general rules of the commons into three. So we talked about the etiquette rules, which I mentioned during the harvest, but also there's traditionally there was a guardian basically, and you have to give the first portion of your harvest to as kind of a gift, a token of appreciation. And then also it's kind of this reciprocal economy thing where if you're asked for honey or space to lay hives, then of course you should do that, and it's expected that you would also reciprocate that later on. Another set of rules is kind of the general ones. So you have to make sure you set down your hives in your own huts, or you ask permission if it's the hives of others, the huts of others. But you can't charge for it. That's just not allowed. And it's also forbidden to set down hives outside of the foraging seasons, because that would just disrupt the kind of natural cycle of things. Finally, there's kind of these beekeeper rules. So which I divided into kind of preconditions and then during the harvest. So for the preconditions, you must be basically an upright person by Islamic standards. So it's really interesting. Like that's basically otherwise you're not allowed to partake. And another thing is, if you have a quarrel, let's say with your neighbor, your disagreement, you have to make sure you resolve that. Then you can come and use the apiary as well. So there's this kind of like social harmony that takes place, right, just by using this commons. And finally, during the harvest, back to the ritual things, there's the invocation or the basmala. They're also dressed in white because they notice, once again, through centuries of practice, that the bees are more at ease, and it also represents purity in Islam and things like this. And once again, modern beekeepers, their suits are white as well. So it's some really interesting lines of investigation, I think, there. But if I can summarize then, I think that there's three takeaways, is that since the beginning, with the Sheikh's initial advice, the well-being of the bees has been central to the institution. In addition, the rights of apiary colleagues are really important to consider and respect and uphold. And finally, there is this notion of Islamically sound status of beekeepers, which promotes not just individual, but kind of group cohesion and norms, let's say. In the end, I think that there's kind of a triple benefit. I think it's obvious for the villagers, and I already mentioned, it's almost this sort of solution to, let's say, urbanization and alternative. To the Moroccan state as well, it has obviously a cultural heritage site, and also essentially a rural population, a village, who's able to be autonomous and happy and things like this. But I think also this is quite interesting for the world. Like as we're thinking about artisanal or organic type of production, right? We don't need to come up with a new thing. Perhaps we could look at pre-existing, even if it's on the margins, pre-existing things, right? That have been functioning and making it happen for a long time. Once again, the economic empowerment of local communities. And finally, I think there's a conservation, perhaps even enhancement element here of the environment, where obviously the apiary would cease to exist if the environment wasn't like maintained and well taken care of. So I can skip that slide. And then to end kind of this case, I think there's a really curious point here that's worth reflecting on. We have an indigenous cooperative operating quietly and inconspicuously in the periphery for centuries, 5 centuries, and it's able to be reliably called upon to address the societal issues and demands of today. And I think that's really remarkable and is kind of a testament to indigenous knowledge and ways of being in general. So the next case I wanted to share is that of Zawiya. And I think it's hard to pin down what a Zawiya is in general. It's also obviously not just exclusive to Morocco, which is the context I studied, but as you know, in Syria, for example, obviously neighboring Algeria, Tunisia, etc. And over history, there have been places where along the pilgrimage to Mecca, people would stop, right, pilgrims. They were madrasas, more or less, right, a place where students could go and learn, starting with the Quran and other Islamic sciences. So they played a variety of roles. And I think the first thing to also know is that some Zawiya are quite, let's say, formal, let's say, or very. This picture is a nice representation of that. Like it's really obviously just the aesthetics. It's quite beautiful, but it's also very much, let's say, well planned and well thought of, etc. I think there's another side of some Zawiya which is extremely informal, which you see here in this picture. This was during a festival, and yeah, so it really depends basically. Where you are and what the Zawiya is, etc. And sometimes what path, let's say, of Sufism that they're influenced by and based on. But if we try to, I guess, focus in on a definition, in the Moroccan context, their origins date back to the 12th century. And as I mentioned, they were originally associated with guilds, for example, lodges. In the Moroccan case, it's really interesting because in the early years of the French protectorate there, they were obviously looking for bureaucrats. And so Zawiya graduates, if you will, people who had been to Zawiya, were not only literate, but they were quite eloquent, well-read, etc. And so many of the early bureaucrats came from Zawiya. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting point. But basically, regardless of its purpose, they're always kind of embedded within and influenced by Sufism and have a specific, let's say, path or tariqah. And in Morocco today, there's kind of this bifurcated or dual system of public administration or governance. One of it is one side is formal, which I argue is kind of this global Western mainstream. And, those are, let's say, the French-speaking urban elites. And then you have the informal side, which are represented very well by Zawiya. And I think that's where you have what I call a ritualization of soft power. In other words, the Moroccan monarchy, being Sharifin and basing its legitimacy on Islam, these types of informal institutions kind of give it kind of ceremonial recognition and this kind of soft power, while at the same time, the Moroccan state in kind gives them autonomy to kind of operate as they've been doing for centuries. This is interesting because, so Samuel Huntington talked about something known as the King's Dilemma, which is more or less, monarchies today have, a choice to make between kind of centralizing, let's say, their power, and that'll obviously bring a sense of stability and social cohesion, etc., but also expanding out power to, let's say, modern groups, and that includes things like, elections, having different, parties, political parties, legislatures, etc. So Huntington said there's basically 3 responses to this. One is a full transition. So we see that, for example, in the UK, in Sweden, etc., to a ceremonial monarchy. You have a continuation, right, of basically very much an executive monarchy. And then you have the kind of coexistence of traditional and modern. So what I call relaxed centralization. And I think that's what you have in Morocco. So in that context, I wanted to just share briefly three examples across these three domains: infrastructure, education, and social services, of giving you a sense of how Zawaya operate and create public value. So geographically, at least, I tried to be a bit like, cover as much as I could. So you have one from the Rif Mountains in the north, from the Atlas Mountains, and then finally in the Anti-Atlas near Agadir in the south. Firstly, with all of these, there is an important, and once again, getting back to indigenizing vocabulary, there's an important concept here called khidma, which I think can be translated as a menial task or service for the public good. And so Zawaya constantly have this in whatever they're doing, whatever public services, etc., they're addressing. But so it certainly promotes social cohesion, right, in that community. But it also kind of promotes, let's say, humility in the individual, and this is once again part of the Sufi practices, and divine accounting, if you will. So in other words, someone is doing this, and it's seen as favorable, let's say, for their life here and the hereafter, etc. And a good example of this is the annual renovation by communities that was traditionally, and in many places still the case, done, because with vernacular architecture, which is basically earth-based, if you allow the elements, rain especially, to year after year kind of hit the walls, etc., to get to the foundations, things will literally start to crumble, right? So it's needed like annual renovation, and so there's kind of like festivals around this, and this is very much a practice here, and I think a good example of khidma. And so yeah, it could be thought of as kind of public works or infrastructure as a khidma. The Zawiya example here of the Baqawa in the Atlas Mountains, they see themselves in terms of the role of the Zawiya as building a solid foundation of knowledge and character for their members, their constituents, etc. And so in order to do that, they need regular communal renovation and polishing. In other words, one needs to attend the Zawiya, one needs to be doing this khidma, doing some of the, not just prayers, but like let's say the dhikr, the extra supererogatory things for worship. And in the end, that means that there's an impossibility of building both architectural and spiritual foundations by and for oneself. So it needs to be constantly kind of revisited and polished and communal in nature. And I thought that was it was a nice analogy. Shifting over to another Zawiya that kind of is known for education, known as Sidi Wagag here in the Agadir region. They currently have about 100 students it's known as a Nizami system, and it's the only Zawiya in Morocco. Normally when you graduate from a Zawiya, you get basically the equivalent of a high school diploma. But in this case, it's actually a tertiary degree, so like a bachelor's basically. And they teach there the Timbuktu syllabus, which is starting with the Quran, Maliki fiqh, Ash'ari creed, and then the trivium. Grammar, logic, rhetoric. They also still teach things like astronomy, and they do so in it's usually a poem, and then you go to the teachers who then break down what these lines of poetry mean, and you memorize it, etc. And so in that pedagogy, it's very much akin to mentorship. You're following kind of the teachers, and how it's done in terms of format. It's one-on-one kind of daily lessons, but they're public. So one student goes, and there's obviously everyone else surrounding and listening in. So it's interesting because you can get a sense of what other people are studying, or perhaps even a preview if you're studying the same text. And there's also kind of private, much more infrequent consultation, right? Be it on the direction of their studies, what they want to specialize in, how things are going personally, etc. So that's a bit of pedagogy. And yeah, it's very much kind of tacit learning as well by observing the teachers, because one student had said in my fieldwork that learning more, it's about learning more from what they do than what they say. So in other words, we're talking about a certain knowledge that's also embodied, right, and that's practiced. In Arabic, ilm wa amal. So they also do kind of the daily group litany there, or dhikr, and once again, it goes back to kind of this infrastructure theme of there's a consistent refinement of a structure, right, or one's character, and that's communal in nature. So finally, the last zawiya is the Shafori zawiya, and for those of you that have been in Morocco probably know this picture here in Chafik, the blue city. And they were and continue to be known about kind of the social services. So they give out money and at least once a week food for the marginalized and needy their community. They also have Quran and Amdah, or poetry recitation, and it's obviously a form of worship, but it's also a form of kind of like once again back to setting social norms. It's avoiding unscrupulous behavior. So instead of people getting together, perhaps like spreading some gossip, things like this, they get together and are able to do this on a regular basis. And yeah, so that's how they see that as playing an important role there for social harmony. There is certainly emulation of the sheikh, back to the education example as well, right? But it's an interesting two-way observation, because the sheikh there of the zawiya, he had said, for example, that he wouldn't give, just as he wouldn't necessarily treat, for example, when raising children, things like this, they have different natures. Sometimes you have to approach things differently. He tries to understand everyone, right? That's part of the zawiya, and try to like help out and assist accordingly. So there's observation on that front, and then obviously the kind of emulation of the sheikh, etc. And what's really interesting, a funny example is there's almost like let's say a Sufi LinkedIn example of networking. So the sheikh obviously has a tremendous network, but it's understood that he wouldn't arbitrarily, if he was approached, for example, I saw this actually, a man approached and was asking him about his daughter had recently graduated and was looking for a job, and he knew the man, he knew his daughter was studying accounting, etc. And he said, yeah, I'll leave it with me. And so it's understood that the sheikh is not arbitrarily going to be like, please get her a job because she's the daughter of this man, etc. But he would make an introduction appropriately, knowing that she studied well and she's keen on getting a job, etc. And the same goes with dispute resolution. So instead of going to a court, which one can in Morocco, to resolve certain things such as inheritance, etc., people go to the sheikh and they just respect that he's not capable of being bought out or corrupt. Like they'll listen to whatever he says and implement it. So it's really interesting, like all these different facets of kind of in a way service delivery, right? It's providing kind of important aspects of everyday life. And this sheikh of the Shafori Zawiya, I think he summarized things quite well when he said, yeah, Zawiya is all about one working with one, which once again refers to this kind of communal nature and all of this. But in Arabic, it could also be kind of this double entendre or double meaning of basically the one, in other words, God working with one, right, with each member, and yeah. So yeah, and that's, I think, quite reminiscent of Zawiya as institutions. Finally, I think these examples show that it's quite possible for these indigenous institutions or collegium to exist alongside a state, right? And it's not so much this kind of competitive thing, but it's very much nested within and granted its own autonomy, right? And I think these are good examples to kind of think about and perhaps try to replicate. Secondly, I think that in my field, at least in governance, public administration, etc., all the rave is about co-production and trying to co-produce services with citizens, etc. But we see these other models of working literally like one-to-one with different members and all of this. And I think that's, I think it's good to kind of expand and defamiliarize ourselves with just, one mode, let's say, of co-production, which is very Western, and then think about perhaps others. And finally, I think these examples of essentially public value creation, Maslaha, it's important to kind of recognize that the greatest, I think, metric of success for institutions is how long they've lasted, right? And I think their resilience is quite impressive and therefore should be kind of recognized and supported as such. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.